よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much, Sugera-san. In this presentation this evening, I'm going to highlight some of the ways that real estate practices in Japan differ from those in other countries. I'm going to cover foreign ownership restrictions, how real estate is listed and sold, legal and registration systems, zoning, mortgages, insurance, and taxes. And this is going to be a very top-level sort of overview of these topics. But let's start at the very beginning with a logical question, which is, who can own real estate in Japan? Well, Japan, as you know, allows foreign ownership of real estate. Non-Japanese people can own land in Japan, and they can also own existing homes and new homes. Both Japanese and foreign companies can own land and buildings in Japan, as can trusts. And in Japan, houses and apartments are very often built on land that's held under a long-term lease. The land can be owned by an individual, by a company, by a Buddhist temple or a Shinto shrine. And homes built on leased land can often be purchased at a very steep discount. And that's because all you're buying is the structure, not the underlying land. And at the end of the lease, you may end up having to pay to have that building demolished. So that further takes away from the economic attractiveness of buying property on leased land. Contrast that with China, where all of the land is owned by the state and can only be owned by the state. The government leases land to end users for 30, 40, or 70 years, depending on what the land is actually used for. And land is returned to the government at the end of the lease period. What you may not realize is when that land is returned to the state, any improvements that are made to the land, like for example, if you'd put up a building, that reverts to the state as well. So that is not a terribly attractive proposition. And it's also one of the reasons why Japan is a very attractive destination for Chinese buyers. In China, citizens can own buildings, but there are city-level restrictions on how many homes a Chinese citizen can own and where he can own them. Restrictions are particularly tight in the Tier 1 cities, which are very desirable cities, and those are Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou. And foreigners can only buy property in China if they have lived there legally for 1 year. And that means living there with a proper work visa or a study visa. You can't be doing visa runs back and forth to Hong Kong, for example. And as a foreigner, if you buy property in China, you can't rent it out. Only you can use it. And that's another reason why buying property in Japan is attractive to Chinese buyers. Looking around Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea all allow some degree of foreign ownership, but most Asian jurisdictions are like Indonesia, which makes it really, really difficult for foreigners to buy any kind of real estate. In Thailand, for instance, there's limits to the percentage of a condominium's units that can actually be owned by a foreigner. And as the case of the Kidman Ranch in Australia illustrates, that country is becoming particularly sensitive about the purchase of existing homes by foreigners. And they've actually started prosecuting foreigners and unwinding deals where foreigners have bought property without proper permission. So if you want to buy property in Japan, where are you going to find listings and pricing information? Well, when you search to buy or rent a property here, you typically would consult a website, a magazine, or the shop window of your local real estate agent. And most of the listings in these categories are powered by the Real Estate Information Network System, or RAINS, which is a system that's only available to licensed real estate agents. Listings in Japan are entirely in Japanese, but actually they're remarkably easy to figure out because they all follow a very, very simple pattern. And once you understand the pattern, you can decipher it with a great deal of ease. That's a big difference from Canada and from the United States, which use something called a multiple listing service, which is a centralized online service that shows almost all of the listings in a given area. The US also has websites like Zillow and Redfin that not only provide listings, but also provide historical data, that provide trends, and can provide things like an estimate of how much money you could get if you sold your house. In Japan, there's lots of professional appraisal services, but it's considerably more complicated and, for that matter, more expensive to use one of these services than it is to browse on a website. Having said that, though, there's a range of companies in Japan now, including startups and some well-established players, that are busy trying to shake up the Japanese real estate market and make it more transparent and make more information available to both buyers and sellers. So clearly it's a good idea to watch this space. The lack of transparency also extends to ownership information. In Hong Kong, for example, where I live, you can buy an abstract for a piece of property from the land registry, and for a few dollars you can learn who owns the property, how much they paid for it, and the abstract also lists outstanding mortgages and things like government orders for emergency repairs and illegal structures. In Singapore, the government has a system called My Property, where homeowners can see their title documents and boundary plans free of charge. In Japan, you get some of this information from your real estate agent, but it's much harder to get than it is online in a lot of other places. Now let's talk for a moment about legal issues. Many parts of the former British Empire, such as Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Hong Kong, are common law jurisdictions. And in common law countries, judges' decisions are based on the precedents or decisions that are made by other judges. Most of Europe and South America, on the other hand, uses civil law, where judges use a written body of law to decide cases. Japan, on the other hand, is a hybrid system. It uses civil law, but it combines civil law with what's called customary law. And Black's legal dictionary, which is the gold standard for these things, defines customary law as customs that are accepted as legal requirements or obligatory rules of conduct. And that combination of civil and customary law makes Japan's legal environment quite unique, particularly when it comes to things like tenants' rights. Another important difference is in the way that sale and purchase agreements are structured. In the West, sale and purchase agreements are usually quite long, complex documents, and they tend to list every eventuality that could crop up in a property transaction. In Japan, the S&P agreement, on the other hand, is really, really short. It covers the basics, it explains the description of the property, it lists the people the person who's buying and the person who's selling, the amount of the sale, and the logistics for the handover, and any special conditions. But that's really all that's in there. In the Western S&P agreement can very easily run 20 pages or considerably more for a major transaction. In Japan, however, this information on a home purchase is covered in the explanation of important matters. And that's read out loud to the buyer by the registered real estate agent. It can only take as little as 30 minutes to go through the explanation of important matters. And I've actually done it over Skype from Hong Kong. If you are buying a big piece of property, or if it's a complex transaction, it can take many, many hours to get through that explanation of important matters, though. Japan is famous for being a non-litigious society, and lawyers play a relatively small role in most home purchases here. In Japan, the judicial scrivener is similar, his role is similar, or her role is similar to that of a notary in a civil law country. The judicial scrivener ensures that the paperwork is all completed correctly, the title is transferred, and the purchase is properly registered with the land registry. Japan uses a deeds registration system in which buildings and land are registered as separate legal entities. In a deed system, there's no guarantee that a property's title is without flaws, such as an incorrect land boundary, a missing document, or even, for that matter, a missing signature. Hong Kong and most of the United States use a similar deeds-based system. But some Canadian provinces, as well as Australia, Iran, New Zealand, Singapore, and many other jurisdictions use something called the Tauren system. When a property has been entered into the registry in the Tauren system, title is assumed to be perfect. And title documents don't have to be verified every time there's a transaction. Buyers and sellers really like the Tauren system because it allows transactions to be processed very quickly. In some countries that use the Tauren system, a title can be transferred in a matter of minutes rather than the 3 or 4 weeks that's common when you buy a property here in Japan. It's also worth noting that all of the documents for sale and purchase agreement or sale and purchase of property in Japan will be in Japanese. And in general, any sale-related documents that are translated into English are there only for reference. They're not legally enforceable. And that's another difference with Hong Kong. where Chinese and English are both official languages and are both equally recognized. And very often in a legal environment, if a contract is bilingual, English is assumed to be the dominant form and the controlling version of the contract. Another important difference is in the way that homes are measured. In Japan, the saleable area of a home is measured halfway into one wall and halfway into the next wall. In Hong Kong, on the other hand, you can find yourself buying a home where elevator lobby, like the one here shown here, lift shafts, clubhouses, and things like that can actually be included in the saleable area. And you end up paying management fees and taxes on that. So it's something that's worth paying attention to. The net result is, in Japan, if you buy something that's advertised as an 800 square foot apartment, you're actually getting 800 usable square feet. Whereas in Hong Kong, an 800 square foot apartment might have as little as 500 or 600 square feet of usable space. So it's worth paying attention to. Japan has a formal zoning system that covers residential, commercial, and industrial space. But zoning regulations in Japan were introduced after many neighborhoods were established and mixed uses were actually very common. Kyoto's machiya shop houses with retail spaces in the front and accommodation in the back are a classic example of this approach. And Japan's industrialization saw factories and other industrial facilities built all over the country, sometimes in very close proximity to residential areas. This site in Neramaku in northern Tokyo is an absolute classic example. A residential neighborhood is less than 200 meters from this gas storage facility that's run by Tokyo Gas. The facility has 6 of these storage tanks, each one of which is about 30 square meters or 30 meters in diameter. This, incidentally, is not unique to Tokyo. I've seen similar arrangements in places like Osaka and Kobe. And I personally would probably think twice about wanting to live in close proximity to a facility like that, especially in an earthquake-prone country. One of Japan's most successful examples of zoning is the notorious Kabukicho red light district here in Tokyo, which was rebuilt as an entertainment zone after World War II. And Japan's urban planning may sort of seem random, but it's actually a major improvement from a lot of other cities in Asia. For instance, this is an urban village in the center of Guangzhou, China, which is an otherwise very, very modern city. And while Chinese and Japanese urban planners may have very different vision, both Chinese and Japanese buyers share a great preference for brand new homes over old ones. And that's rational for several reasons. First, over the past couple of years, the Japanese government has encouraged the creation of long-life houses and apartments that can be renovated and updated. In addition to having high-quality design and construction, new buildings are more environmentally friendly, incorporate green features, and use less energy than older structures. And they also cost a lot less to operate. It's also smart because new buildings meet the current seismic standards, and that took on a whole new importance after 2011 with the earthquake. However, if you're buying a new property here, you have to be aware of the depreciation hit. New homes depreciate very, very quickly in Japan. Buyers' preferences for new buildings, coupled with Japan's 8 million empty homes and the poor quality of many of the older properties, mean that old homes are very often demolished rather than being renovated. So that means that if you're a buyer looking for what we call a handyman special, a home that you can buy cheap and improve with painting and plastering on the weekends, you're probably going to be disappointed. Furthermore, there's not really a lot of do-it-yourself culture in Japan, as there are in many Western countries. After the property boom and bust of the 1980s and 1990s, it's not surprising that many people in Japan choose to rent rather than own their homes. Japan's home ownership rate is approximately 62%. That's much higher than Germany, where 53% of people own their homes, but far less than Singapore, where 91% of the population own their own homes. However, that statistic only tells part of the story, because homeownership rates vary greatly across the country. In some rural areas, more than 70% of the population own their own homes. On the other hand, Tokyo has the nation's lowest proportion of owners at just 45%. That large population of renters combined with relatively generous rental yields, makes Japan, and particularly Tokyo, an attractive place to be a landlord. And that attraction is compounded by the fact that Japanese tenants are stable and tend to move quite infrequently. Japan's residential mobility rate is about 21%, and that compares with, say, 41% in Canada and over 50% in the United States. The net result is when somebody moves in, they often stay, sometimes for decades. Now let's talk about money. If you're a Japanese citizen or a legal resident of Japan, banks will lend you money to buy a primary residence or a second home. It becomes easier and significantly cheaper for foreigners to get a loan if they're a permanent resident of Japan or married to a Japanese national. Cross-border mortgages are common in many markets. For example, Canadians borrow to buy homes in the United States, and UK citizens buy holiday homes very commonly in places like France and Spain. In many places, you can also borrow across borders for an investment property. Unfortunately, if you don't live in Japan, it's very, very difficult to get financing for a Japanese property. In fact, as of September 2016, I know of one finance company that provides mortgages on Japanese property to Hong Kong residents, and there's one bank each from Singapore, Taiwan, and mainland China that lends to nationals in their respective countries. Otherwise, you're pretty much out of luck in that regard. Non-resident buyers are really a niche market in Japan, and compared to Japanese nationals, non-residents pay higher interest rates, they typically get lower loan-to-value ratios, and shorter loan tenors. And because this is not a core market for banks, these mortgages can be withdrawn on very, very short notice, and that's something that happened back in the late 2000s, when around 2008, 2009, when some Australian banks here were loaning to people who wanted to buy property in Niseko, and they subsequently withdrew from that market. You can mortgage, if you're looking though for options, one thing that you can do is mortgage a home that you own outside of Japan and use the proceeds to buy a Japanese home. If you're buying en bloc, buying a whole building, you can form a company and use that company to obtain financing. However, this is an expensive and a time-consuming solution, and it's really not practical unless you're buying a whole building. Or you can do what most people do and pay cash for it. And speaking of money, unless you're a legal resident of Japan, you can't open a bank account here. That means you'll have to rely on an agent to collect the rent for you, you pay your bills, and also to remit the proceeds to you overseas, or you'll have to come here and collect it yourself. Your agent, you may also rely on your agent to do things like filing your income taxes for you. Fire and homeowners insurance in Japan are similar to packages available in other countries, but as in many places, earthquake damage and the destruction caused by subsequent fires and tsunamis are excluded from fire insurance policies. Furthermore, in Japan, earthquake insurance is not available as a standalone policy. The only way that you can buy it is as a rider to your fire insurance policy on your home. It's also worth noting that there are caps on how much coverage that you can buy. In the end, you may simply decide that earthquake insurance is just not worth the cost, given that most of the value in a Japanese home, particularly an older one, is in the land and not in the structure itself. Finally, a quick note about taxes in Japan. You pay consumption tax on the price of the building and on the agent's fee when you buy. And when you buy, there's also a relatively small stamp tax and an acquisition tax. And you also pay income tax on any rental receipts that you might generate. And you can claim the usual range of deductions for things like depreciation and repairs. What makes Japan distinctive, however, is that there are local, prefectural, and national taxes, and they're based on no less than 5 separate and different appraisal systems. These appraisals really don't have a lot to do with the market price of a piece of property, and they're conducted on different schedules by the National Tax Agency, by the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism, and by individual municipalities. There are several suspended taxes, and it's also worth noting that the government plans to raise the consumption tax from the current level of 8% to 10% in 2019. When you sell a property, you pay capital gains taxes, which are reduced if you've held the property for more than 5 full years. And this is different from Hong Kong, which has no capital gains tax at all, and places like Canada, which offers a deduction from you if you from capital gains when you sell your principal residence, as long as it has been used as your principal residence. So that's a quick, high-level view of some of the differences between Japanese real estate markets and markets in other countries. And for more information, please have a look at my books, Landed Japan and Landed Global, and those are available in both print and ebook editions. And now I would like to open the floor to your questions. Thank you.